The dashboard says everything is green. The annual assessment is signed, the latest framework update is accounted for, and the audit committee finally has the slide they wanted. But everyone in the room also knows that half the environment now runs on architectures that never existed when those controls were written. New software as a service, SaaS, platforms, artificial intelligence, AI, co-pilots connected to production data, shadow application programming interfaces, and a reworked identity stack are all stitched together by people who have never read the control spreadsheet. On paper, you are compliant. In practice, you are guessing. This is a Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, and it is about what happens when controls lose context and compliance checklists start to backfire. The core idea is simple. Compliance only creates real protection when controls are designed, implemented, and evidenced in the context of how your environment actually works. When checklists are treated as the product, you get impressive paperwork that no longer matches your systems, your workflows, or your real attack paths. Over the next few years, as architectures become more composable and teams ship change faster, leaders will feel even more pressure to certify environments they only partially understand. The risk is that compliance turns into a parallel universe with its own language, rituals, and pass-or-fail logic that no longer maps to where incidents actually happen.
There is a reason checklists are so attractive, especially for a Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, who lives under constant scrutiny. In a world of shifting architectures, constrained headcount, and impatient boards, a dense control matrix feels like certainty you can hold in your hands. Frameworks such as the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, standards from the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and sector-specific regulations show up pre-packaged with control families, requirement numbers, and test procedures. They convert a messy risk landscape into boxes that can be filled, tracked, and reported. A CISO can point to a completed checklist and say, with some confidence, that the organization did what is expected, and regulators, auditors, and customers often reward that kind of signal.
Over time, the checklist itself becomes the product. Teams learn that the fastest way to reduce friction with audit and risk functions is not to design better controls, but to become experts at answering questions. Control descriptions start to read like small pieces of legislation, tightly scoped, written to be objectively testable, and crafted around the last assessment rather than the current architecture. Because these artifacts drive audit outcomes, they quietly start to shape how work is perceived. If a requirement appears on the checklist, it must be important. If it does not, it quietly becomes somebody else's problem, even if it is where the real risk now lives.
This pattern is reinforced by how responsibility is distributed. Compliance and risk teams are measured on closing observations, not on whether those observations connect to real attack paths. External assessors are rewarded for consistency and repeatable testing methods, not for challenging the scoping assumptions that keep everyone comfortable. Vendors promise instant compliance, mapping their tools directly to control language in glossy matrices. All of that makes it even easier to treat the checklist as the ground truth. Everyone works hard, everyone is busy filling fields, and yet the model of the environment baked into the paperwork gets further away from what engineers actually operate in production.
The brutal disconnect shows up when an incident and an audit packet tell different stories about the same system. On one screen, there is a detailed set of controls mapped to multiple frameworks and marked as operating effectively. On the other, a real attack path walks through a modern data flow nobody ever modeled, using a SaaS integration that bypassed the carefully controlled perimeter. The logs the responders actually rely on come from platforms that appear nowhere in the control inventory. The runbooks invoked under pressure bear little resemblance to the procedures described in the evidence bundle. By every formal measure, the organization is compliant, but it still failed where it mattered most.
These failures usually trace back to stale scoping assumptions. The original control set was scoped around a data center, a handful of business-critical applications, and a limited list of suppliers. Since then, workloads moved to cloud-native platforms, developers embraced managed services, business units signed their own SaaS contracts, and AI tooling began to operate on sensitive data. The control narrative never caught up. New systems are folded into existing control statements with a vague note that they are also covered, or they are quietly treated as a vendor's responsibility. The checklist stays tidy, while the architecture grows wild branches that nobody has mapped.
One-size-fits-all controls make this even worse. Policies written for traditional network controls get retrofitted to SaaS, identity federation, or data sharing models with only a few words changed. Test steps are copied verbatim from on-premises playbooks into shared responsibility contexts that simply do not match. Leaders see reassuring coverage percentages without realizing that the same generic language has been stamped across very different risk surfaces. When an incident exposes the gap, the usual conclusion is that execution failed. The harder, more accurate conclusion is that the rules never really applied to this path in the first place, and nobody felt safe saying that out loud.
If the checklist has become the product, the way forward is to put architecture back at the center of assurance. Controls are not abstract phrases. They are behaviors implemented by specific components, platforms, and teams along concrete data paths. A requirement that says sensitive data is encrypted in transit only means something if you can point to the systems, interfaces, and trust boundaries it applies to. Leaders who want meaningful compliance insist that every major control domain is anchored in diagrams and inventories that engineers recognize as real. The key question becomes where, in very practical terms, each control lives in the environment.
This does not mean every security leader has to become a chief architect, but it does demand a different working model between security, architecture, and platform teams. Instead of drafting control language in isolation, security and compliance staff sit with system owners to trace critical flows such as customer onboarding, payment processing, data science pipelines, and incident response paths. For each flow, they identify which control obligations matter and where they should attach, whether that is the identity layer, the data store, the integration bus, the application gateway, or the endpoint. The output is a living map where controls are bound to concrete components and dependencies, and where changes in architecture are expected to trigger reassessment rather than quiet exceptions.
Once architecture is in the loop, assurance activities can evolve beyond sampling a single item once a year. Sampling strategies can be tied to real usage patterns instead of arbitrary counts. Evidence requests can be tuned to the systems that actually carry risk. Configuration exports from specific platforms, traces that show end-to-end flows, and change records that demonstrate how new services were brought under control. Over time, this approach creates a feedback loop. When engineers propose a new service or integration, one of the first questions is where it lands on the control map. Compliance work becomes an extension of architecture hygiene instead of a parallel bureaucracy, and leaders gain a far more defensible story when regulators or boards ask if the environment is truly under control. Even with architecture at the center, context-aware controls will drift if ownership is fuzzy and incentives pull in the wrong direction. In many organizations, control design and maintenance sit with a small group of risk or compliance specialists who do not own the platforms where those controls live. Product teams and platform engineers experience controls as tickets and checkboxes, not as design constraints they share. When incidents happen or audits raise awkward questions, leaders end up mediating between groups that each did what they were measured on, yet collectively missed the bigger picture. The operating model quietly teaches people that the real goal is satisfying the reviewer, not shaping the environment.
Changing this pattern requires being explicit about who owns context. Control narratives should not be written only by compliance staff and then thrown over a wall. Security architects, platform owners, and product leads need to be visible co-authors of the control set that applies to their domains. Their names should sit on diagrams, on implementation notes, and on review calendars. That does not mean every engineer becomes a policy author. It means every major system has a small, named group responsible for making sure the way it is secured still makes sense, given the way it is built and used. Ownership becomes traceable, and outdated assumptions have a harder time lingering unchallenged.
Incentives need to support this model of work. If teams are measured only on closing audit actions, they will aim for the fastest path to no findings, which often means minimal changes and maximal storytelling. If leaders instead pay attention to reductions in exposed attack paths, faster time to bring new services into the control map, or the quality of cross-team design reviews, behavior changes. Risk and compliance functions can still track completion rates, but they also highlight when a team chooses to renegotiate a control because the environment changed. Over a few cycles, the organization learns that updating a control to reflect reality is a sign of maturity, not a failure to comply.
Evidence is where many programs quietly give away their power. In the rush to satisfy auditors and regulators, organizations default to the easiest artifacts to produce, such as screenshots of settings, copies of generic policies, or a few log snippets showing something happened once. These fragments may be enough to satisfy a test procedure, but they rarely tell a coherent story about how the environment behaves under real load, during real change, or in the middle of a real incident. Leaders end up with thick evidence packs that are functionally unreadable and practically useless for decision-making. The effort is enormous, yet the learning value is almost zero.
A more intentional approach treats evidence as a window into the system, rather than a stamp on a checklist. Instead of asking what file can be attached to prove a control exists, teams ask what they would want to see if they were trying to understand how that control works in practice. That question pushes the organization toward end-to-end artifacts, such as a sequence of logs showing a complete transaction path, a change record tied to updated diagrams and test results, or a sample of access reviews that clearly distinguishes between system roles and real-world job functions. Evidence becomes narrative, not noise. It shows the control's intent, where it sits in the architecture, and how it behaves over time.
This shift also changes how evidence is produced. Rather than scrambling before each assessment, teams design controls so that useful evidence is a natural byproduct of normal operations. Monitoring dashboards capture trends that double as audit trails. Runbooks are written so that, when followed, they automatically generate the logs and records that matter. Automation pipelines record which controls were validated as part of a deployment. The audit binder becomes a curated export from living systems instead of the output of a one-time artifact factory. When leaders sit with this kind of evidence, they can ask better questions about whether the story of the system makes sense and whether they would be comfortable explaining it after a serious incident.
At its heart, this topic is about whether your controls describe your environment as it actually is or as it once appeared on a neat piece of paper. The comfort of the checklist is real. It offers structure, comparability, and a shared language with regulators and auditors. But when that comfort hardens into ritual, control narratives drift away from the architectures, data flows, and working practices they are supposed to govern. You end up with a split-screen reality, where incident reviews and audit packets describe different worlds, while accountability still flows upward to the same leaders. Closing that gap means treating context as a first-class part of every control decision. Architecture, ownership, and evidence are not supporting details. They are the medium through which controls become real. When leaders insist on controls that are anchored in recognizable diagrams, co-authored by the people who own the platforms, and evidenced with artifacts that show behavior over time, the shape of the work changes. Teams learn that updating a control to match a new pattern is a sign of strength. Evidence production shifts from a seasonal scramble to a side effect of well-instrumented systems and disciplined change.
What changes most is how leaders frame the core question. Instead of asking whether the organization is compliant, The sharper question becomes whether they can defend that the controls make sense for how the organization actually operates today. That lens turns board conversations, budget debates, and vendor decisions into chances to align assurance with reality. A practical starting point is to ask which controls feel most detached from how work is really done, and where incident narratives diverge from audit narratives. The slow, sometimes uncomfortable work of reconnecting those threads is how you move from paperwork that backfires to controls that genuinely help your organization survive contact with the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.